I was actually talking to Patricia and Alexandra before we joined this call, and it struck me that there may, quite depressingly for me, because I'm quite old, there may be quite a few people on this call who have never actually used a floppy disk in anger before, or even seen one, but that's what they are. There they are, that's what they look like. Why have we got an image of a floppy disk? Just to set the scene as to how ransomware started, and the first recorded ransomware attack was in 1989, where a chap turned up to, I think it was a World Health Organization conference, and handed out 20-odd thousand infected floppy disks. Things have moved on a lot since then. This is an incredibly sophisticated enterprise, and it represents a real risk to many organizations, in no matter what sector they're in, no matter what size they are, no matter which country they're in. So in our team, we deal with a very large number of cyber attacks, and a large proportion of those in the past 18 months or so have been related to ransomware. And they can, the attackers can vary from all sorts of groups and individuals. So we sent around as part of the sort of the pre-reading or pre-watching a short video from the Davos summit a few years ago from, I think it was the chief executive or chairman of Maersk, the shipping company. And if you have the chance to watch that video, you'll have seen the devastating impact of a ransomware attack on that particular company. And that was caused by a nation state attack that arose from the war in the Ukraine. I think one commentator described that particular attack as using a nuclear weapon for a small tactical victory on the battlefield, because the ramifications of that nation state attack spread very quickly around the world. And again, we act for clients in the critical national infrastructure sector, in the health sector, universities and research, those that have been involved in COVID-related infrastructure, for whom nation state attacks represent a real risk. At the other end of the extreme, you have script kiddies. And to give one example of that, there was a breach a few years ago by which the telecoms company TalkTalk. They ultimately got hit by a fine by the Information Commissioner's Office for that data breach, but that was caused by I think he was a 17-year-old boy sat in his parents' house, playing around, showing off to his friends online, causing very significant issues for that company. But the most significant attack group that we see are cyber criminals. And this is now a real developed industry whereby attackers will hold companies to ransom in pursuit of profit. And to give a really good example, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an attack on a Florida-based software company that I think as a result of that impacted close to 1,500 companies worldwide. The attackers demanded a £70 million ransom to effectively decrypt the systems. What's quite nice about this is, and obviously we had to put an obligatory picture of a chap in a hoodie on these slides because it's about cyber and you have to do these things. They have really good names. So the attack group behind that particular attack was called Revil. You have companies called Evil Core. It's all very sort of like something out of a TV program. So what happens? What do we see? Well, these groups, whether they're a nation state, an individual, or more likely a criminal gang, will find a way in to an organization's IT estate. That could be a phishing link, it could be a vulnerability, whatever it is. They'll spend some time in there snooping around, elevating privileges, and then do two things. This is the common attack vector. They'll take a load of important sensitive data, and then they'll also drop an encryption malware over the systems to encrypt the systems. So this means the organization has been hit twice. It's a double whammy. You have the inability for some of your systems to be used. Could be users locked out of their workstations, for example. It could be production plants shut down, whatever it is the business does. But also you've got this threat of, we're going to publish this data. We're going to send it to one of your competitors. We're going to stick it on the dark web unless you pay us the ransom. And all of this, therefore, leads to some real world business critical risks to that organization, involving very senior level decisions to be made as to what to do. But this can result in reputational harm, it can result in financial harm, it can result in the data on your customers, whether that's individuals or companies, being published, legal consequences, including regulatory investigations and litigation being brought against you by affected individuals or your companies. So our role as lawyers is to help organizations who suffered an attack like this navigate some of those challenges, navigate the legal risks. And that's what we're going to turn to now by way of continued scene setting. So I'll hand over to Alexandra, who will talk a bit more about what we do as a team to help clients with the response to an attack like that. Alexandra, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart, and hi, everyone. So this slide isn't actually related to ransomware specifically, but that alone demonstrates that it is important not to view ransomware in isolation. So ransomware attacks are some of the most serious, and they are business critical and provoke a particular emotional response. I mean, who likes to be threatened or blackmailed or held hostage to ransom? So it therefore requires careful and structured response, which addresses each of the areas shown on the screen. So this is not a strictly linear process, and given the urgency and tight turnarounds, these stages will likely overlap and run in parallel. So for example, the company will be immediately concerned with putting an incident response team in place, but also with initiating fact-finding to verify the hack and close off the associated vulnerability as soon as possible. So first we look at fact-finding. This is essentially the who, the what, the where, and the when. And this is all critical to understanding what has happened and how to respond. So IT forensics is likely to play a critical role in any cyber incident, and particularly so in ransomware. And they will investigate what unauthorized access has occurred, how it was gained, what was the footprint of the attacker in the systems, what data sets have been accessed and or exfiltrated. And as part of the legal team, we want to ensure legal privilege. The report that the IT forensics team produces may contain harmful statements as to the state of IT security, and the appointment of lawyers can maximize the ability to claim litigation privilege. So this ties into the governance section, which we will go on to next. So the typical crisis management team will need someone senior who can make decisions. So for a business critical ransomware event, that is likely to be someone from the C-suite. So a chief exec, chief financial officer, chief information security officer, and so on. 2, someone to address legal risk and advise on the legality of the proposed steps. 3, someone from IT who can understand the technical aspects. And 4, someone from PR or communications so that they are well informed and able to prepare a public statement and stakeholder group announcements at short notice, should that become necessary. So now on to containment. This considers 2 elements, the first technical and the second legal containment. So just looking at technical first. So the key here is containing the vulnerability and getting the threat actor out, and also restoring the systems from backup or decryption. So some questions to consider here are, can the data be recovered? Have all alternative options for recovery of data and or the systems been considered and deemed either not possible or not financially viable? Or is the vulnerability closed down? So some considerations for legal containment. A key part of the attacker's modus operandi is the threat of publication of stolen data. So this could be on the dark web, on hosted leak sites, on social media posts, but what can you do? What about if bloggers or the press get wind of this? So some things to consider include monitoring the deep dark web, surface web, and the leak site on an ongoing basis for data leaks, and also planning for steps to contain as far as possible publication and dissemination of data. So this might include takedown notices to host sites. So moving on to the assessment of legal obligations. So Patricia will go into this in more detail, but in brief, this deals with your legal, contractual, regulatory, and other obligations to notify. And lastly, communication. So this considers your PR communication as well as communications with the threat actor. For PR communications, think about the narrative and how you want to take control of it. And when considering engaging with the threat actor, this is something that we will pick up after the group exercise, and we would be interested to hear how you would approach this. But broadly, you would need to consider a few things like whether it is legal to pay ransom, whether you are comfortable in doing so for ethical or moral reasons, because technically you would be funding criminals. Do you need to do so? So can you get your systems back up and running, or do you need to limit the publication of data? And also, do you even have the money to pay? So these are just some considerations for now, but let's move on to Patricia, who will take us onto notification considerations. Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Alexandra. Righty-ho. Hi, everybody. So we're at the section on notification considerations and the more legal aspects of everything. So Stuart and Alexandra have already set out the scene and given you the more initial introductory parts of it, but this is where we get into legal. So the GDPR applies here specifically, and there are some legal obligations that are triggered if you think you're a victim of a cyber attack or anything of the sort. So here, the first question that you need to hit is identifying whether a party is a controller or a processor. So a controller is a natural legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data. I'll explain in easier terms later. Whereas the processor is essentially a natural legal person, public authority, which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So the last three words there, on behalf of the controller, is the crucial differentiation between a controller and processor. So when we get to GDPR, the question that you have to answer is essentially, has personal data been impacted in the event of a cyber security event? So a personal data breach is defined on the screen as a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. So if you break that down, that's a relatively general definition, but the individual words in there are crucial. So for example, if your data is permanently encrypted, then this can constitute loss after unlawful destruction there. If your data has been altered, i.e. it's been encrypted by the hackers or the the threat actors, which is the more common term used for hackers, then that constitutes alteration. If your data was exfiltrated, i.e. taken out of your system, a copy is made, that's essentially unauthorized access to personal data, which doesn't necessarily need to be taken, the information, if it's encrypted, because if it's encrypted, it's also been accessed as well. So under this definition, just access to your data is enough to trigger a personal data breach event. So under Article 33 in the GDPR, if there's been a personal data breach and you're a controller, so you're automatically assumed to notify the Data Protection Authority, which in the UK is the ICO. This is the automatic assumption unless you can prove that there's unlikely to be any risks to the individuals involved, to your clients or to the employees or of the sort. You need to prove this, but if you can't, there's a relatively tight time frame. You only get 72 hours to notify them. And this is something that the threat actors are also very aware of. So imagine you're a threat actor and you want to cause as much disruption as possible to the business or to the individual you are hacking or threatening. When would you do this? Over the weekend. Stuart will attest to this, and Alexandra as well, but there are a lot of, we call it Cyber Fridays, and Friday is usually the day that when people get primed for getting a lot more incidences, because people want their weekends, and the 72 hours, if triggered by Friday, means that everyone needs to scramble over the weekend to potentially make notification by Monday morning to the ICO. So that's one of the tricks the threat actors like to use. Continuing on to Article 34. So Article 33 was reporting to the Data Protection Authority. Article 34 is in relation to notifying data subjects, so people whose data are at risk. So the controller here, again, not processor, has an obligation to notify these data subjects if they know there's a high risk or they suspect there might be a high risk of their data. So this depends on the situation, depends on the information that they hold, and crucially, sometimes whether the threat actor has exfiltrated the data, i.e. taken a copy. So moving on, so this is the legal side of things based on the GDPR. Continuing to the second arm here, it says other regulatory. So this depends on your business, whether you are in what sector you're in. So for example, if you're in the financial services sector, you're an accountant, you would definitely be regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. If you're a law firm, we have the Solicitor's Regulatory Authority, and we have reporting obligations under there. And you will, if you're in the infrastructure industry, you may have very specific critical national infrastructure considerations. Charity Commission, they regulate charities. They are educational regulators for universities. So it's very much dependent on what type of business you're at and whether there's an umbrella organization that oversees that, which might apply specific obligations to you. Third is contractual. So based on your contract with an IT service provider or supplier, for example, you might also have additional, this is the third layer of obligations, which might require you to report under different timeframes. Maybe they want you to give them a phone call within 48 hours of you noticing that there's been a breach. Maybe they want you to notify their C-suite. Maybe they want you to give them a report. So there are, based on your contract, there will be different kinds of obligations that you also have to keep an eye on, specifically timeframes to follow. Fourthly, law enforcement. So depending on your case and the exfiltration, whether you want to involve the police or different measures of law enforcement, has different pros and cons to it. So the best advantage to actually informing the police and lodging a police report is that you can say that you've done it to potentially your clients or to the victim. So it's great for your breach narrative, i.e. the story that you're going to give out. For companies and individuals based in the UK, the National Fraud Cybercrime Centre is Action Fraud. So making a report to Action Fraud can attract some involvement from them, because it depends on how many reports they get daily, weekly, etc. The one benefit of doing this is that you get a crime reference number, which you can then quote to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. A few things that an additional advantage is if you have, is dependent on the ransom. If there's been a cyber event, if they want the ransom from you, and this is a high ransom in the millions, in the 100,000s, for example, this can attract specialized police resource. So the National Cybercrime Unit, the NCCU, they're the leaders of the UK's response to cybercrime. So they coordinate the national response to the most severe cybercrime threats. Maybe sometimes they hit national scenes, etc. So there's also the National Crime Agency's Anti-Kidnap and Extortion Unit. This is getting kind of dark, apologies, but their acronym is the AKEU. They usually work closely with the National Cybercrime Unit in investigating / responding to significant ransom demands or ransom demands that get into the more criminal realm. There are disadvantages, however, to involving the police. They potentially could take control of the investigation if they deem it severe enough. This means they can take over all correspondence with the attacker and can contact them on your behalf without you knowing, which could be very dangerous because it essentially means you lose control of your response process. So I've just run through all the notification considerations that you as a business should bear in mind. So this is what partially what your workshop will be based on. And hopefully all of you will have your email as well as the questions to hand. We're going to embark on the workshop soon, but if you haven't taken a quick screenshot, or potentially bear in mind a quick summary of your considerations as to what you should do are A, is this a personal data breach? B, are you regulated by any sectors or industry specific regulators? Is there a contract in place? And do you want to involve the police? So based on the information that you're given, make assumptions on them. And we will put you into separate breakout rooms. Wonderful. Thank you everyone for staying with us. And I hope your breakout rooms were interesting and that you guys got enough time to go through all the questions. So I wanted to firstly tell you guys, this is an actual ransomware message, hence the blackout. So this was one that Stu worked on, and can you imagine literally getting this in your inbox or just finding this somewhere on your systems and just being like, is this real or not? So yeah, actual ransomware message, actual font and style they use. I don't know why they picked yellow or why they wanted to be dramatic, but I guess, yeah, we didn't come up with it. It's an actual thing. So now feedback. Can I ask rooms 1 and 4 to answer question 1? Can the representatives for room 1 come up? The question was, when you get this message, who do you reach out to? Firstly, what kind of support do you need internally, externally, and what kind of role would they provide? Do we have the rep for room number 1? S'il vous plaît.
We didn't actually choose a rep, but I will do it.
Perfect.
On behalf of the team. Hi everyone.
Hi Lottie.
Hi team. Yeah, this is really interesting. I haven't worked on one of these before, so we had a good discussion. And we said initially we want a crisis management team. So we want someone senior, such as the CEO or info security officer. We want a legal team, so someone to address the legal risk for us. Someone from IT as well for the technical aspect of everything, and also someone from PR as well to help us with the external PR response.
That sounds pretty full.
Very good, Lottie. Very good, team 1.
Thank you.
Team 4, did you have anything to add to that at all?
I'm going to cautiously appoint myself as spokesperson as I took the notes.
Perfect, William.
Yeah, we thought that it would be, well, hopefully we'd have a policy in place that has a checklist or notification list in place for this, like a dawn raid kind of thing, but for ransomware. So yeah, reaching out internally to the DPO, to IT, to contain and investigate the attack, see if it's actually credible rather than just a random note. We don't want to get too worried if it's just spam. Legal team to assess the response, look at what our obligations might be. If we're a data controller, any contractual notification obligations to the, sorry, if we're a processor, any contractual obligation notification obligations. And then, yeah, senior person, comms, PR, and external lawyers maybe for expertise.
Nice. Sorry, cutting in here, Stu, but I want to put it to Stu. When you said DPO, William, the data protection organization, at first instance, Stu, is it the done thing, or would you recommend reaching out to them at first instance?
Sorry, I meant officer, not organization.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. So Lottie, William, thanks very much for feeding back. I think 2 really good answers, covered a lot of the ground that we would hope has been covered. So you're very well prepared. Pick up your point, William, about what we would hope that most of the organisations that we work with have done some sort of pre-breach work beforehand, some readiness. They have exactly those policies in place that that if something happens, this isn't a complete panic moment. Obviously, this is a very critical moment for the business, but they will hopefully have got those policies in place, and they'll practice them as well. So they're showing how to escalate it, how to pull in the right teams, and that's something we are increasingly working with clients to do that preparedness piece, so that they are quicker and better able to respond if something like this happens. But you both identified exactly the right points there in terms of pulling together the right teams, and those organizations that we work with in these sort of crisis moments that've got the right individuals on that first phone call who can make the right decisions. Absolutely critical. The ones that we struggle with that actually become a more labored response process is if you have a conversation but you haven't got the right individuals there, you haven't got the right people from the technical perspective who can actually provide the answers, you haven't got someone at that senior level who can make those decisions as to what to do, and there were a lot of decisions to be made in a very short period of time. I think you both really sort of excellently identify the sort of the internal roles that you would expect to have. There will become a point, particularly in a sort of very critical incident like this, a ransomware note being landed. At what point do you pull in your external advisors? So looking at the sort of the three most common roles, you would have a IT forensics, who are specialist in exactly this sort of thing. And you do get that stage, that handover point of the internal IT team can be really good at that first response step, but there will probably become a point where they get to the limits of their business as usual expertise, and therefore need to get someone who's a bit more specialist who can interrogate the logs and really find out what's happened. Similarly for external lawyers, you may well have a really excellent internal in-house legal team, but not that aware of that many who would be able to respond to this kind of business critical event, and therefore you might need to get specialist lawyers in. And similarly from the communication side, I think you both mentioned sort of the need to be able to think about the communication strategy, and therefore there are dedicated crisis communications outfits out there who are specialized in this sort of role. But no, I think that they're excellent answers. Before we move on to the next one, I'm conscious of time, but were there any other points that any of the other groups identified that were different to those? But otherwise, let's just move on to question 2.
Anyone want to shut up?
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Matters we discussed in my group was whether you need to get in touch with your insurers as a sort of first step, because I guess if you want to make a claim further down the line, it's important to sort of notify your insurers as soon as possible. And it also occurred to me the insurers might be quite helpful in terms of recommending data forensics, and they might sort of want to have quite a lot of input in terms of how the investigation gets carried out. So I guess as a sort of first step, I think that's maybe something that the company should think about as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Lucy. Really good point. Increasingly, companies have taken out cyber insurance or insurance policies that have a cyber element, and you're right. Both you want to have the coverage of the indemnity under the insurance policy, effectively indemnified for your costs, but also one of the benefits of insurance policy, and particularly for sort of SME businesses that may not necessarily have panel firms available to them, there will be panel firms that could be used by the insurance arrangements and dedicated specialists. Very good point. Thanks for flagging that.
Following Lucy's point as well, sometimes depending on your insurer, they might have different forensics teams or different PR teams, and we'll get down to question 3 and 4, but when it comes down to potentially engaging with a threat actor, depending on the insurance company's chosen forensics company, they might have different providers who have different experience in dealing with different kind of cryptos. Some might not have the wallet ready, some might not have indemnity to say they can deal with threat actors. So the type of forensics company that you take and the PR company that you actually in the end engage can be quite crucial, especially in time pressured circumstances where you need to respond ASAP, and then faffing about and then having to find out whether your insurer, one of the companies, has a wallet access or not, then drags on time, and potentially you might annoy, a ruder word came into mind, you might annoy the threat actor, which you want to avoid. So yeah, I think that's question 1. For question 2, can I have rooms 2 and 5, please, rooms 2 and 5 to feedback on the question, do you involve law enforcement?
I can go for room 5. We
Francesca.
kind of all very quickly agreed not to involve law enforcement at this stage.
Okay.
Because to us, with the ransom message, it seemed quite vague. So we thought that it could potentially, nothing could even have been accessed or taken, and it's potentially phishing in regard to the download at the bottom. So looking into whether something has actually been taken, it could be nothing has even been accessed or taken, and we don't want the police to then start communicating with the people that are mentioned at the bottom, and then we have no communication with them when we could potentially find out that it's just an empty threat and they wanted us to click on the download, and then the download takes it to where they do then access all our files. So we thought getting in touch with law enforcement at this stage would not benefit us.
Jumping the gun, perhaps. Yeah. If we don't have anybody from room 2, I think, Stu, would you like to go ahead with your analysis of that?
Absolutely, and thanks, Francesca, for that answer. And I think you've identified one of the main issues, or one of the main considerations for whether to involve the police, which is that point about loss of control. Now, the police can be a really helpful resource, and they can provide expertise, particularly as Patricia mentioned earlier on, for those sort of more high-value ransom demands, or if there's a cross-border element. So we've worked with the police before where they've got really good ties with the FBI in the US, for example. But one of the downsides is exactly that point. You lose control. It's a one-way street. You're giving information to the police, and albeit lots of good reasons to do so, including for the public good of building up intelligence about these type of groups. But you're very unlikely to get support back. It will be looked at through the lens of what the police want to do, not necessarily what your organization wants to do. And I also agree at this stage it would be a bit premature. Might want to consider that later on in the process once you know a bit more. But thanks, Francesca, for that answer.
Out of curiosity, is there any other group who decided contrary to actually include the police? Does anybody want to discuss that?
Because the information was encrypted in the scenario we're given, so there is a possibility of encryption, exfiltration, and copying. So that's a question mark there.
We considered that there might be a possibility that other companies have been affected by the same attack, because often, threat actors are going to want to exploit one vulnerability as widely as they can, because as soon as you do it once, it's going to get patched. So, if just for the sake of knowing, that could be useful.
Absolutely.
Good.
Number 3, do you think, Patricia?
Yeah, we could move on. Question 3, can room 3 and 6 please feedback with their responses to whether you need to notify any regulators or telling any of the individuals affected, including employees? Room 3, do you want to go?
I think we were room 3. Didn't spot the number. Hi. Yeah, well, regulators would obviously depend on your industry, but like you say, Financial Conduct Authority and everything might be necessary. The telling of individuals affected. Now, it's quite interesting because I've actually just recently had a couple of third-party data breaches affecting our employees. I posted something in the chat about the difficulty of controller processor. One was a company that provided the service of providing childcare vouchers and other employee benefits. Now, to my mind, they sell that as a service to companies, that if you want to get your childcare vouchers through us, you can do so. But they insist in their contracts, and these were signed long before I joined the company, they've insisted on positioning themselves as a processor, not as controller. So they then hand over and say, hey, mate, we've been breached. It's your problem. You're the controller. You tell everyone. And I just think it is so woolly. Where the process works, the employee says they want childcare vouchers, we say, okay, go to this other organization's website, enter your details. They do that. That organization sends us an email, says, will you please confirm these are your employees? We do that. To my mind, they're acting as a controller. They're not a processor, but they won't see that. And, what do you do? And it's only when you get a breach that you then start really thinking about it. So, on that one, the only information breached was name and national insurance number. we decided it was up to that organisation to tell the ICO. It was their breach, not ours. But we did tell the ICO it had happened as well.
So you also notified them, yeah?
Yes, but not holding hands that it was our breach, very much saying it was their breach. And we've not heard any more from the ICO on that one, so they obviously weren't interested in us. They didn't see us as the controller, as far as I see. But yeah, that one where it was name, company, national insurance number, we felt the risk was probably, and it was only a small number of employees, about 4 they reckoned that were affected, so we felt there was limited risk there. But then we had another one where, in fact, our insurance brokers who were trying to sell us cyber insurance got breached.
Yikes. So that's perfect. Sorry to cut in, Andrea, but that's exactly the kind of issues you need to determine whether you're a processor or a controller, and that definition very much, there's gray areas to that, but only controllers have the obligation to notify. So that's why, as you say, a lot of companies try to run into the processor realm. Room 6, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I could add something. I guess before you go and sort of tell your staff, tell sort of third parties, I suppose you want to figure out a strategy for limiting any potential reputational damage. And so, I mean, the ransom note says that mass media is going to be made aware. So you probably want to figure out a strategy in terms of the media, whether you want to be sort of proactive and sort of go to the media first, at least prepare a statement, or reactive. I mean, the last thing you want is a member of staff going to the media and sort of losing control of the situation in that respect. So I guess that's just another consideration you just want to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point. So thank you, Lucy and Andrea. Before going to the media though, one way is to make sure that your employees know, because if they find out through a news report that your company's been breached, then you'll have a storm of internal messages going, what's actually happened? Are we impacted as well? Is that right, Stu? Would you say that's correct?
I would, and there's tons to talk about here. I mean, this is at the heart of what we do in terms of advising the legal ramifications and the communication strategy and the risks that go with it. So you know, I could bore you all for another hour or so, but I'm conscious of time and it's a nice day out there. There's better things to do. But this is what we do. There's lots to consider. And I've also picked up some of the messages on the chat, some really good points in the chat about, well, when do we become aware of there being a personal data breach? What sector are we in? What's the type of data we're processing? Andrew raised some great points about that controller processor dynamic, which is almost a separate area, and she's absolutely right that there's some real grey areas in terms of actually the role that organizations are performing. But here what we would be trying to do is understand as quickly as we can do actually what data has been impacted, because you could drop a ransomware note on someone's system and encrypt all their systems, but actually there not be a personal data breach at all there, depending on the technical way in which that's done. Likewise, they could have spent months inside the system picking and downloading really high sensitive data and sticking that on the dark web tomorrow, and that clearly has a much more high risk effect on the individuals affected. So there were lots of considerations. One point just about communications is just, and I alluded to it at the very beginning, this area, data breaches and the loss of individuals' data, is a really hot topic at the moment. It's a very litigious area. There's a court case between the Supreme Court in a court case called Lloyd versus Google. We'll get judgment handed down on that case either before the summer break, but more likely in the autumn. That is a very, very important decision about this area, and therefore one consideration in terms of telling people, individuals, etc., is just the risk of bringing these class actions, representative actions, mass claims against the organisation that, hey, you've lost my data, that's £750 I would like for that, please, as a result, which on itself might not sound too much, but if you have 100,000 customers that have been impacted, that clearly adds up very quickly. So really great points, both fed back and in the chat, and lots of things to consider here. Again, conscious of time, so why don't we just pick up question 4? I'm intrigued to hear what people said about this.
Yeah, specifically room 4 and 8 quickly. Did you have any responses to this? What are you going to do about ransom? Are you actually going to engage? Room 4?
Again, I think we were hoping that we'd have a policy, but it would depend whether there was just encryption or whether there was any actual evidence of data exfiltration. Because if the threat to release it to the press is real, then obviously there's more motivation to get in touch with them. And then there's a thought, are they going to comply if we actually pay them? probably, we thought, well, at least I thought probably yes, because as soon as you don't honor your bargain, nobody else is ever going to, comply with a ransom demand again, but it's still a risk. And then there's the possibility, is it going to constitute a further breach of data protection obligations to get involved? Like if you ask them to decrypt for you, does that make them a processor without a contract? I don't know.
Good questions. Last room 8. Did you guys have any other points to add?
Yeah, I think we just have one more point to add. So we just thought about like if we'd taken out insurance and we were using that insurance to cover this specific ransomware instance, whether there were sort of procedures and policies within our insurance policy that we'd need to stick to as well.
Nice. Usually, you're usually not able to decide what to do about the ransom without actually engaging with the hacker/threat actor. So that decision usually comes, if you want to be informed, after your forensics team has assessed that actually A has been damaged, B data has been taken, and C this data is at high risk. It includes like passport pictures or personal health data, the level of data that's been exposed. Would you say? What do you think, Stu and Alexandra?
So I think this is really sort of a really hot topic, and William again made a really good point about doing some thinking beforehand about what a company's approach might be to ransomware. So we've seen some clients who effectively plaster all over their websites, we do not engage with cyber terrorists, we do not pay ransom demands because we see it as funding crime. Others will be a bit more nimble and sort of see what happens. Loads of things to consider. I mean, one of the key things, that the starting point, which again we would help out with, is, are you able to? Can you legally pay this threat actor group? In the UK, there's no sort of overall bar in paying. It's not against the law to pay ransomware, but there are various things that we need to give very careful consideration to and do a lot of due diligence on who this group is. Would we be infringing terrorism provisions? Would we be committing an offence under the Proceeds of Crime Act, money laundering? Are they on a sanctions list, etc.? And again, that gets complicated when it cuts across different jurisdictions, including the US. But parking that all together, let's assume that we haven't found any reason why you couldn't do so for legal reasons. I mean, does this fit with your ethics as a company to make payment? Do you need to, William's point again about have you got your data back? How important is that data? Do you trust them to hand over the encryption keys and effectively keep their side of the bargain? And generally, you're right, William, they tend to, because effectively this is very much a business model, and although you can't necessarily trust the word of a thief, they do have this ironic, I mean, some of the sites on the dark web effectively have a TripAdvisor type rating of 5 stars, 4 stars, etc. So just pick up a couple of comments in the chat. Do you engage the cyber criminal on behalf of the client? If the decision was taken to engage the cyber criminal, there are specialist organizations that will do that, and they will need to do very certain checks and effectively sign those off. And to Eleanor's point about the insurance, and again, this is generally speaking, insurance policies will allow for payments to be made to ransomware, but they would expect you to go through certain points in order to do so, which broadly would include that due diligence step and negotiation. You can negotiate it down. They might demand 5 million. You might agree that you can pay them £1 million. It is very much a business model. And I think there's another point about the engaging with criminal elements as such. So would the police have to be involved? No, it's a private transaction if that's what you choose to do. And again, subject to doing those checks that you're not infringing terrorism laws and the like, then effectively you'll choose to do. But this is a hot topic, and it is coming under a lot of scrutiny. And this is something that there may well be significant movement in the years, months ahead, whether that's at a policy level or in the sort of the insurance sector, because there is this real concern that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy that people are paying ransom demands, and therefore that is fueling the rise in ransom attacks. But no easy answer, particularly if you're the organization that has lost all your really important data and you can't access your systems, and the only way to get it back is either to rebuild from scratch or pay some money.
Would you engage professional negotiators if you did intend to consider paying the ransom, so that you have someone who's a specialist in the field that can negotiate them down, or possibly keep them talking while you get more information?
Exactly that. There are firms out there that can help with that sort of process that we would often work with.
to strategically offer maybe 20% and then depend on their language, etc., offer 40, offer 60, and then have a bar. And there are also delay tactics that negotiators like to use as well, to just say we're having difficulty obtaining that sum, or we don't have that kind of, if they ask for the payment to be in crypto, we don't have that kind of crypto wallet, to just play for time. And I think, I forget if you were involved in this case too, but there was one case that we managed to get the threat actor to give us until New Year's. So it was almost an entire month for us to get the money. And this is very rare. But that was only a ransom of 300,000. There was one case that involved $1 million. And I remember sat in this room thinking, is this for real? Actual 1 million ransom demand, and am I involved in this? Crazy, absolutely crazy. So thank you for your question, Amal. Does anybody have any more questions for Stu, Alexandra, or me?
Yeah, just a quick question about whether you think that a particular sector or industry is more targeted or more vulnerable than others. I mean, in your experience, have you seen focused attacks on particular sectors?
That's a really good question. It varies and it goes in waves. So sort of historically, the sort of financial services sector has got the most to lose, but they've also got the wallet to put in place the defences, and therefore actually are pretty well secured. In the past 18 months or so, there's been a real spike in attacks against construction clients, the infrastructure sector, energy, etc. But it is really sector agnostic. I think any organization can be attacked, and the number of organizations we work with just varies. I mean, you name it, we probably have helped them through this kind of, whether it's a ransomware attack or a cyber attack more generally. Charities, universities, retailers, unfortunately it's very prevalent. Probably time for another question, and then I think we should probably wrap it up.
You mentioned earlier that threat actors are aware of companies' GDPR obligations and are using those to add extra weight to their demands. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you've got data protection legislation potentially incentivizing these attacks. Is there a way to avoid that, or is it just an inevitable consequence of having these laws in place to protect consumers?
Oh, that's a challenging question to finish on, William. I don't necessarily see them as sort of weaponizing data protection legislation. I think it is definitely an element of it. I think the real drivers here is that organizations know that one of the things that's changed over the past couple of years is this dual attack. It's not just encrypting systems, which used to be the historic way of doing this, that you locked out your systems. You know, the WannaCry attack on the NHS involved locking you out of the systems. It's that taking the data as well. Now, I think they're aware, and I think Patricia's point is that there may be an awareness of what the obligations are in the data protection legislation, but really it's the reputational harm and the sort of extortion element of, I'm going to do something with your critical data, that I think drives a lot of it.
So the ICO is quite flexible as well. If you can explain why you couldn't notify them within 72 hours, if you're still investigating or determining the threat or even the risk to employees or to victims, data subjects specifically, and if you can naturally explain, we just weren't sure if this constituted high risk or not and wanted to continue investigations, they're usually quite reasonable to that. So the 72 hours is not a recommendation. They could penalize you, but if you can explain in a way, they will listen.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Well, I think it's a thank you from us for attending and for your excellent contributions through the group exercises, and those that volunteered to feedback. Some really good questions in the chat. Thank you from me to Patricia and Alexandra for doing all the hard work of preparing this session and for running it. Yeah, thanks for coming, and I hope everyone gets to enjoy the remainder of the sun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the people who asked questions, Lucy, Amal, William, Lottie, and for being back as well. So this is the trainee group or the SCL, and we are also hiring for the next academic years committee members. So if you're interested, just go to the SCL, helloscl.com, and just maybe email, and you might be welcomed into the committee. So yeah. Thank you so much, Stu and Alexandra, for speaking. And I'm going to be on for the next 5 minutes if anybody wants to stay on. But yeah, otherwise, have a lovely afternoon.
Bye all.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you all very
you.
much.
Bye.